The reading is in 1 Kings 19, 11, and 12. If you don't mind, let me add a few other verses to put it in context. The text is Jezebel is threatening Elijah and swearing to take his life. And the question is, the great man of faith has done great things, and why is he there? And it's verse 9, and he came to the cave, lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have been forsaken, and their covenant torn down, and their altar, and they were killed by the prophets with a sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." So he said, "Go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind was rending the mountain and breaking it to pieces, the rocks before the Lord. And the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a gentle blowing. And it came about that when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in the mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?"
I bet all of you can, if I asked you to write it down, you could probably think of a high point in your life where if you could go back, in fact, asked you, I'd like to experience that 15 minutes again or that hour again. There's probably a high point in your life that you recall with some fondness. And you can probably also think of a low point in your life and say, if I had the opportunity, I'd never want to revisit that again. And I wonder if it's true of everybody that at some points in your life, they kind of tend to come close together. I don't know if that's the case for you. I know for Elijah, if you were to ask him, say, yeah, there was a high point in my life and a low point in my life. They were neighbors. They were right next to each other. Maybe it's happened to you where right after something pretty good has happened, something pretty tough has happened, or maybe vice versa, where it was just a rough patch. And then very quickly, it seemed like overnight, things got better. That's one thing about life is it's kind of up and down like that, but it's not always like that. But when life goes from one extreme to another, maybe you can think of it as having spiritual whiplash. It just kind of can throw a curve at you, and it's kind of hard to bounce back from that right away. Especially when things go from good to bad, it's hard to stay optimistic. I'm going to briefly mention some things that are in 1 Kings 18 to lead up to what was read for us for our scripture. And if you were to ask Elijah about one of his high points, I think he would pick the time that he took on King Ahab. He had kind of a contest. King Ahab was a very dangerous man. He was very corrupt, but he was also very weak, and you'd think that would make him less dangerous. But he was corrupt and weak, and that combination actually made him more frightening because that weakness could be manipulated, in particular by his wife Jezebel, who was very famous for being a very ungodly woman. And Elijah met Ahab for a showdown on a mountain, and with Ahab there were 450 prophets of Baal, a false god at the time. And so Elijah took on these people, and he confronted all the people as well. 1 Kings 18:21, he kind of confronts the people with this question. This is Elijah speaking to the people. It says 1 Kings 18:21, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." And they don't respond. It's kind of just a zero reaction. I think it's interesting. One of people's number one fears is public speaking. Here's Elijah dealing with a hostile audience. I can't even imagine. But he seems so confident. It's kind of important to keep this in mind because of what's about to follow this high point in his life. He challenges all these guys, the prophets of Baal, to a contest. He even sets things up so that the odds are in their favor. And I'm not going to go into detail for that. If you don't recall, you can look at this later. But 1 Kings 18 describes this confrontation that he has. And for the sake of time, I'll just tell you how it turned out. Elijah won big time. No contest. Of course, God demonstrated that he supported Elijah. And God used Elijah to turn things around. It was kind of the beginning of the end for Ahab, you could say. And if you had talked with Elijah, if you'd caught him right after that, he probably would have said, that was great. That was a real high point. But then things take a really bad turn. Ahab went home and told his wife, Jezebel, what had happened. And then she sends a message to Elijah. It's recorded in 1 Kings 19, verse 2. This is a message from Jezebel to Elijah, and the short version is this. She sends the message, you're a dead man. That's what she essentially tells him. Now keep in mind, Elijah had taken on Ahab, the king at the time, and 450 prophets of Baal and assorted other people that were there who were kind of wishy-washy about it. But when he got this message from this one woman, he was scared. In 1 Kings 19, verse 3, it says he ran for his life. And he ran away and he found a place to hide. That might say something about Jezebel and her power that she had at her disposal. But it may tell something about Elijah that right after this, it just took this message from her to make him run. 1 Kings 19 records where Elijah's discouraged. He doesn't want to do this anymore. And God understands. Even at one point, God tells him, he says, the journey is too great for you. I bet you some of us have felt that way. This journey's too big for me. I can't deal with this journey. So Elijah's kind of overwhelmed. He ends up in a cave. I don't know if you've ever been that down to where you go to a cave, but that's what he does. And if you were to talk to him at that point, he'd say, this is the lowest of low. This is a low point. He's ready to give up. If you talk to him, he would have probably said, the world just seems so messed up. And it's heavy on his mind. And Elijah felt like he was the only one. That's maybe a topic for another time, where he just felt like he was on his own. And powerful people want him dead, in particular Jezebel. There's this cloud over Elijah. He's cynical. He's lonely and discouraged. And it seems like the plan, if his life just doesn't end, the plan is just to live in this cave. This is it might be as far as he's thinking. But then Elijah gets another message. This one comes from God. Here's 1 Kings 19, verse 11. So he's in this very, very low point. And I want to point out this morning what God did in order to communicate with him and what that might have to do with us. It's more than just a poetic moment here. This is 1 Kings 19, verse 11. This is God speaking to Elijah. So he said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, which is a big, big deal. And a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. Now, you read that, it sounds like maybe just some poetry and just a nice little thing to say, but there's something here. I think there's some significance to this. It seems like that last sound, that gentle blowing or a whisper, is what draws Elijah out of the cave. He tells them to come out and stand. There's going to be a message, but the last part of this message, for whatever it's worth, is kind of like a whisper. Here's 1 Kings 19:13. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. That seems to be the part that gets him, that captures his attention. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And they have a conversation that they had before. He's trying to get him to get moving again. He's kind of settled into his despair. God asked Elijah this question before, but this is a turning point for him. And God gives Elijah a new plan, and Elijah leaves the cave. So God sent a message to Elijah in this case, but I wonder why that last part, that gentle wind or that whisper. God sent, this storm and an earthquake and fire. Is it just, special effects, just attention-getting things, or is there something else going on? He could have used the storm to wear the mountain down and bring Elijah to his knees. He could have done that. He could have used the earthquake to make Elijah run out of the cave. He could have used the fire to burn him out of there. But God held these things back. They occurred, but he held them back so that Elijah survived this encounter. It says that each time these things happened, God was not in these things. It makes it a point. So this occurred, but that wasn't God. And then this occurred, and that wasn't him, and so on. It says, but then it's just kind of left hanging. But this gentle wind seems to be significant. The final expression was gentle. I guess the first part might have gotten his attention, but it seems like that the most important part is that last part. When God began the conversation, he began with a whisper. And in this case, at least in this case, gentleness was needed. It's very important that Elijah be approached gently. In 1971, there was a gorilla that was born at the San Francisco Zoo, and they named her Coco. She was kind of famous. Some of you may have heard of her. And she became part of an experiment, and pretty impressive, especially in scholastic circles, and the college eggheads were very impressed by her because she learned sign language. She learned up to about 1,000 different signs, and they were very impressed by that. And that got the attention of the scholars. But what got the world's attention was something else that happened with her. They didn't get the world's attention until she did something else. In 1983, Coco asked for a Christmas present. She knew enough sign language to do that, and she asked for a cat. I said, what do you want for Christmas, Coco? She said, I want a cat. I said, okay, we've got this covered. They give her a stuffed animal, but she didn't play with it. She kept making the sign for sad. This is not what I wanted. So on her birthday, they brought a bunch of abandoned kittens to her, and she picked out a gray male cat, and she named him. His name was All Ball. And later they brought two other kittens for her, and one was called Smokey, and one was called Lipstick. But what really got everyone's attention, just the fact that she wanted this, but when she became kind of a star of the news, is pictures and video of her holding this kitten. She was very gentle, which is exactly what a kitten needs. Coco weighed 280 pounds. Her pet kitten did not weigh 280 pounds. If Coco had pet them too hard or played too hard with any of the kittens, that would have been the end of the kitten. And it's amazing to watch this gentleness this strength under control in the form of gentleness of Coco. It's not the same, if you saw another kitten treating that kitten with the same affection or gentleness, it wouldn't be the same, would it? Or even a bigger cat, or even a human being. But to watch this gigantic, powerful, lethal animal treat this little animal with such gentleness really captured everybody's attention. She was impressive because she had a lot of power, but it was under control. I wondered about this because when God communicated with Elijah, God had power. He could summon the storm and the earthquake and the fire, but he also had the control. That's very important for us to be able to interact with him. If there were no filters, if there was no restrictions, no control about his power, none of us would be able to approach. The earth would not survive. I'm not sure everything that this encounter with Elijah, what it implies, but it seems like this gentle whisper is what brought a man who had lost his hope out of that very dark cave. And even though the storms and the earthquake and the fire are powerful, a whisper kind of has its own power. We know that. It draws our attention. It's the sound of a secret. Somebody saying something to somebody else, and our ear automatically attunes to it. It's something important being said usually, or something that's designed for one person or just a few people to hear. Whereas storms and earthquakes and fire, that's kind of general audience. It's very broad and general. A whisper is very specific. There are many times in the Bible when God interacted with the world, but at one point, he didn't just send another message. At one point, he came himself in flesh and blood. We were talking about that in class this morning. When God came to earth, if he had arrived in his total strength, in his total presence, I don't think the world could have handled it. Literally, I think it would have fallen apart. Just touching Sinai with the tip of his finger, in a sense, nearly shook it apart. When it comes to encountering spiritual things, the physical realm is very fragile, very kittenish, if you want to think of it that way. In comparison, it's much like a gorilla with a kitten. When this realm interacts with the unshakable realm, this place proves to be very shakeable. And Mount Sinai alone demonstrates this. So when it came to Jesus, I would like to suggest that God, in a way, whispered. He was the King of Kings. Jesus was the creator in flesh and blood, and he came to our world to live a perfect life, but he did it gently. Matthew 12 quotes Isaiah 42, but Matthew 12:20 is quoting Isaiah and says something. It's easy to kind of pass this by as, again, just more poetry, I guess, but it's not just that. There's more going on. It's Matthew 12:20, and it's describing the Messiah, our hero, our Savior. It says, "A battered reed he will not break off, and a smoldering wick he will not put out, until he leads justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope." This battered reed idea, you might imagine a plant that has been bent in half. It wouldn't take much more to finish snapping it in two, to finish the job. Or imagine a very small flame that's also described here. Maybe just a match that's barely alive, just flickering. It would take the slightest breeze or a breath to snuff it out. Jesus didn't arrive like a storm. He could have. You think about all the options God had as far as his arrival in flesh and blood. It could have been devastating. But Jesus did not arrive like a storm or an earthquake or a fire. He could have. Instead, he arrived like a gentle wind. No fanfare, not one trumpet. There was a limited announcement to some people that knew of his arrival, but relatively quiet in comparison to what it could have been. In the midst of the world stuff, the arrival of the Creator in flesh and blood was just a whisper. I mean, on a spiritual level, it was well known and prophesied, of course. But in a food trough in a nowhere town, it seems like a very quiet way to arrive. In a way, Jesus was a human whisper, a gentle message from God. It's important to remember Jesus is extremely powerful. Matthew 10:34. Matthew 10:34 says, "Do not think I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." There was this, I guess you could say, a harder aspect of his presence being here, but as far as his interaction with the world, it was very gentle. His arrival was well documented, and people were given plenty of warning, and it did shake the earth, but in a very gentle way. Jesus is extremely powerful, but Jesus didn't come to fix the world. He came to provide a safe way out of it. He came to disrupt things in the biggest way possible, but his gentleness gave him that edge. It made all the difference. He was the creator under control, walking among his creation like a whisper. Just like a whisper, people often stopped to listen. Now, there was no secret about what he had to say, but it was only his followers that stuck around long enough for the full explanations. And just like a whisper, people would stop and listen, and he automatically drew attention. And even when he hurried away from the spotlight, and several times hundreds followed him, they were desperate to be healed, but ultimately it was what he had to say that got their attention. Not what he yelled at them, but what he said. Jesus also was like a whisper because even though he dealt with crowds, the most profound interactions often seemed to be with Jesus on an individual basis. Like a whisper, his words were designed for one soul at a time. When it all came down to it, and the same is true today, he's all about individuals. He often singled out people, got them away from the crowd to change them as an individual. Zacchaeus comes to mind, the woman at the well, and there was a blind man that was pulled aside from the crowd. Jesus saves souls one at a time. He may talk to the crowds, but like a whisper, he's meant for one person at a time. He does not mass produce Christians. And even now, when an individual soul is baptized, I think we underestimate what this verse says in Luke 15:10. When a soul makes the decision to be baptized, that one individual draws the attention of heaven. Luke 15:10 tells us there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. It's a very individual recognition. So I would suggest in many ways Jesus was like God whispering. Like with Elijah, Jesus is the whisperer who can be the turning point for us. Like Elijah, we can feel overwhelmed. We can kind of take a look at the world and say it's all messed up, it's all lost. But like Elijah, we can feel cynical or pessimistic. And sometimes we're at a high point, and sometimes we hit a low point, and we can become discouraged and have kind of a darker idea about what's going on. Or we can end up living in sin. Not much different than trying to live in a cave. I bet you, even though none of us have lived in a cave, in some ways we actually have, in a figurative way. Our anxieties can also put us in a cave, whether it's our sins or our cynicism or pessimism. It can very much feel like that. Well, so here's a message for any of us who might be living in one of those caves. You can leave. I'm not sure what it takes to get each person out. For Elijah, it wasn't a storm or an earthquake or a fire, but it's kind of a wake-up call to realize life doesn't have to be like this. When Elijah settled into his custom-made cave of pessimism, God helped him get over it. And the first step was to get out of the cave. God sent his message through his son, and that same message is now contained in the Word. It's the Word that can get us out of the cave. If we're not into our Bibles on a regular basis, the world kind of chips away at our optimism and makes us cynics and makes us kind of settle into our dark cave. And it helps us, the Bible helps us to realize things are not as bad as we might think. We live in a corrupt world, but we belong to Jesus, who has won and continues to win. The plan is not slipping through God's fingers. There are spiritual threats. There always have been and always will be. There are souls in danger, always have been and always will be. We just need to make sure that we're out of the cave, that we're listening to what God has to say in the pages of his word. And just like always, it will ultimately come down to an individual decision. The message has been delivered, and now it's up to each one of us as individual souls to decide what to do next. Pray you'll think about this while we stand together and sing.